Everyone laughed at his fat wife, until she rode with 200 warriors. The thing is, Cora Lane had always known this day would come. Not the laughter. That had been going on for 3 years now. Every time she walked through town, every time she bought supplies, every time she simply existed in a place that had decided she didn't belong. No, what she had known was that someday, someone would push too far. She just hadn't expected it to be today. Malachi found her standing by the window perfectly still, watching something in the distance that he couldn't see. Her hands weren't shaking. They should have been. After what Otis Clay had said in front of the entire general store, after the way the other women had turned away, after the way even the children had started pointing and whispering. But her hands were steady as stone. "What are you looking at?" he asked. Cora didn't turn around. "Dust," she said simply. "On the horizon." Malachi squinted through the glass. He saw nothing but empty prairie, the same endless stretch of grass and sky that had been there every day for the past decade. "I don't see any dust." That's when she smiled. It wasn't the sad, resigned smile he'd grown used to seeing when the town folks made their jokes. This was something else entirely, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "You will," she said. "They're about 2 hours out." How could she possibly know that? How could she see something he couldn't? And who exactly was they? But the question that would haunt him most, the one that would keep him awake for weeks afterward, was why his wife, his gentle, quiet wife who had never hurt anyone, who had endured 3 years of mockery without a single word of complaint, why she looked so satisfied when she said it, as if she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. 3 hours earlier, Otis Clay had made his biggest mistake yet. Not that he knew it at the time, of course. To him, it was just another Tuesday morning at the general store. Another opportunity to get a few laughs at the expense of the fat woman who had somehow convinced Malachi Brooks to marry her. The town had been making those jokes for years now, and Otis considered himself their unofficial leader. Cora had walked in quietly, as she always did, carrying her basket and a short shopping list written in careful handwriting. The store had been crowded that morning, filled with ranchers picking up supplies and their wives gathering ingredients for the church social. Perfect audience, Otis had thought. Perfect timing. "Well, well," he had announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Look what the wind blew in. Hope you brought your wagon, Cora. Gonna need something strong to carry you and all them groceries." The laughter had rippled through the store like wildfire. Even Mrs. Henderson, who usually kept to herself, had covered her mouth to hide a smile. But it was what came next that crossed the line. Otis, emboldened by his audience, had walked around the counter and stood uncomfortably close to Cora. "You know, I've been thinking," he had said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Poor Malachi's been looking mighty thin lately. Probably ain't getting enough food at home, what with his wife eating it all before he gets a chance." The store had gone completely silent then. Not because anyone was offended, but because they were all waiting to see how far Otis would push it. How much humiliation one woman could take before she finally broke down and cried, right there in front of everyone. Cora had stood perfectly still, her brown eyes fixed on Otis's face. She hadn't said a word, hadn't moved a muscle, hadn't even blinked, just stared at him with that strange, unreadable expression that made some folks in town whisper that she might not be quite right in the head. After what felt like forever, she had simply picked up her basket, turned around, and walked out. No tears, no angry words, no dramatic exit, just silence. It had been almost disappointing, really. Otis had been hoping for more of a reaction. Now, watching his wife stand by that window with that same unreadable expression, Malachi found himself remembering every cruel word, every snicker, every time someone had made his Cora the target of their entertainment. The memory made his chest tight with anger, but there was something else there too, something that felt suspiciously like fear, because the dust cloud Cora claimed to see was getting closer, and somehow, impossibly, he was starting to see it too. Word traveled fast in a town the size of Cedar Ridge. By noon, every person within 20 miles had heard about Otis Clay's performance at the general store, and most of them thought it was the funniest thing they'd heard all year. The story grew with each telling, becoming more elaborate, more cruel, more entertaining. By the time it reached the saloon, Otis had become a local hero for finally saying what everyone was thinking. Malachi heard it from 3 different people on his way home from checking the cattle. Each version was worse than the last, and each person who told it seemed to expect him to laugh along. When he didn't, when his face remained stone cold and his jaw clenched tighter with each word, they would trail off uncomfortably and find somewhere else to be. He found Cora in their kitchen, moving around with a purpose he hadn't seen in months. She was pulling items from their pantry, stuff they almost never used, dried herbs that had been gathering dust, salt packed in small cloth bags, strips of jerky she had made last fall, strange items for a regular meal, but she was arranging them with the careful precision of someone following a recipe she knew by heart. "Cora," he said quietly, "we need to talk about what happened today." She didn't look up from her work. "What about it? About Otis? About what he said? About how you just walked away?" Now she paused, her hands still for just a moment. "What would you have had me do, Malachi? Start a fight in the middle of his store? Give them even more to talk about?" There was something in her voice, something he'd never heard before. Not sadness or resignation, but something that sounded almost like amusement? As if she knew something he didn't, as if she was enjoying a private joke at everyone else's expense. "I just don't understand how you can be so calm about it," he said. "They've been treating you like this for 3 years, and you act like it doesn't even matter." Cora finally looked up at him then, and her eyes had that same strange quality they'd had by the window, distant but focused, like she was looking at something far beyond the walls of their small kitchen. "It doesn't matter," she said simply. "Not anymore." Before he could ask what she meant by that, the sound of hoofbeats reached them through the open window. Not the steady clip-clop of a single horse, but the rhythmic thunder of many animals moving together, moving fast. Cora smiled, and this time there was nothing sad or resigned about it. This time her smile was sharp as a blade and twice as dangerous. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the window, looking out at the approaching dust cloud that was now visible even to Malachi's untrained eyes. "Right on time," she murmured, and somehow those 3 words carried more threat than any angry outburst ever could have. The first thing Sheriff Rufus Garrett noticed was how they rode. Not like outlaws or drifters or any of the usual trouble that wandered through Cedar Ridge. These riders moved with military precision, their horses in perfect formation, creating that massive dust cloud that had been visible for miles. The second thing he noticed was that there were a lot more of them than he had initially thought. A lot more. From his position on the main street, Rufus counted at least 50 riders in the front line alone, and they kept coming. The sound of their approach had drawn every person in town out of their homes and businesses, creating small clusters of nervous spectators along the wooden sidewalks. Women pulled their children closer. Men instinctively checked their weapons. Even the dogs seemed to sense that something significant was happening. Otis Clay emerged from his general store, his earlier confidence from the morning completely evaporated. "Sheriff," he called out, his voice higher than usual. "You seeing this? What do you think they want?" Rufus didn't answer immediately. He was too busy trying to understand what he was looking at. As the riders drew closer, details became clearer. These weren't outlaws or bandits. These were Native American warriors, painted for battle, carrying traditional weapons alongside more modern rifles. Their leader rode a massive black stallion and wore a headdress that marked him as someone of considerable importance within his tribe. The formation came to a halt at the edge of town, close enough that everyone could see them clearly, but far enough away that no one felt immediately threatened. The silence that followed was deafening. 200 pairs of eyes stared at the town, waiting for something. But what? What do they want? Mrs. Henderson whispered to her husband, but loud enough that half the street could hear her. Why are they just sitting there? That's when Malachi Brooks appeared, walking down the main street with his wife beside him. But it wasn't Malachi that drew everyone's attention. It was Cora. The woman who had been the target of endless jokes and cruel comments was walking with a confidence that no one in Cedar Ridge had ever seen before. Her back was straight, her head held high, and her eyes were fixed on the leader of the mounted warriors. As they watched in stunned silence, Cora raised her right hand in what appeared to be some kind of signal. The response was immediate and shocking. Every single warrior raised their weapons in unison, a coordinated movement that created a sound like thunder rolling across the prairie. But they weren't pointing their weapons at the town. They were holding them high, as if in salute. Otis Clay's face had gone completely white. Several other townspeople were backing away slowly, uncertain about what they were witnessing, but smart enough to recognize that the balance of power had just shifted dramatically. Whatever was happening here, whatever connection existed between the fat woman they had all mocked and these fierce warriors, it was clear that none of them had understood who they were really dealing with. What happened next would be talked about in Cedar Ridge for generations. Cora Lane, the woman who had endured 3 years of mockery and humiliation without saying a word in her own defense, began walking toward the mounted warriors. Not hurriedly, not hesitantly, but with the measured pace of someone who knew exactly where they belonged and had every right to be there. Malachi started to follow her, but she turned and placed a gentle hand on his chest. "Stay here," she said quietly, and something in her voice made it clear that this wasn't a request. It was a command, given by someone accustomed to being obeyed. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Cora approached the leader on the black stallion. When she was close enough, she began speaking in a language that no one in Cedar Ridge had ever heard before. The words flowed from her mouth like water, fluid and natural, as if this was the language she had always been meant to speak. The warrior leader listened intently, occasionally nodding, his stern expression softening as she continued. "What is she saying?" Mrs. Henderson whispered frantically to her husband. "How does she know their language?" But nobody had answers. They could only watch as their understanding of Cora Lane completely crumbled. This wasn't the shy, overweight woman who bought flour and sugar from Otis's store every week. This was someone else entirely. Someone who commanded respect from warriors. Someone who spoke with authority and was listened to without question. The conversation continued for several minutes before Cora turned back toward the town. When she spoke again, it was in English, but her voice carried across the street with a clarity and strength that made everyone strain to hear every word. "3 years ago, I came to this town hoping to live quietly," she announced. "I married a good man and tried to become part of your community, but you decided I was nothing more than entertainment. You decided my worth was determined by the size of my body and the softness of my voice." Otis Clay was backing toward his store, his face pale as paper. Several other townspeople were doing the same, suddenly understanding that they might have made a terrible mistake. "Today, some of you pushed too far," Cora continued, her eyes finding Otis in the crowd. "And my patience has finally run out." She turned back to the warrior leader and said something else in that mysterious language. The response was immediate. Half of the mounted warriors began moving, surrounding the town in a wide circle. They weren't threatening anyone directly, but the message was unmistakable. Nobody was leaving Cedar Ridge until whatever was about to happen had been resolved. Cora walked back to where Malachi stood, her hand finding his with surprising tenderness. "Now," she said softly, "it's time they learned who I really am." The warrior leader dismounted and walked toward Cora with the careful reverence of someone approaching royalty. As he drew closer, the family resemblance became unmistakable. The same dark eyes, the same strong jawline, the same bearing that commanded respect without saying a word. When he reached her, he did something that made the entire town gasp in unison. He bowed his head and spoke a single word in his native language, a word that clearly meant something important because every other warrior immediately followed suit. Malachi felt his world shifting beneath his feet. His wife, the woman he had shared a bed with for 3 years, the woman he thought he knew better than anyone, was clearly someone of immense importance to these people. But how, and why had she never told him? Cora spoke to the warrior leader again, her words flowing with the easy familiarity of someone who had grown up speaking this language. She gestured toward the town, toward the people who were still standing frozen in shock and fear, and then back toward her husband. The conversation was brief but intense, and when it ended, the warrior leader looked directly at Malachi with eyes that seemed to see straight through him. "My brother wants to know if you are worthy of me," Cora said, turning to face Malachi with an expression he had never seen before. Not the gentle, patient look of the woman who had endured years of cruelty and silence, but something harder, more regal. "He wants to know if the man I chose to marry understands what he has, and whether he has defended what belongs to him." Brother. The word hit Malachi like a physical blow. This fearsome warrior, this leader of 200 mounted fighters, was her brother, which meant that Cora was not just connected to this tribe, she was part of their leadership, part of their royal family, part of a world that existed far beyond the small boundaries of Cedar Ridge. Behind them, Otis Clay was making small choking sounds. Mrs. Henderson had gone completely white and was gripping her husband's arm so tightly that her knuckles had turned the color of bone. The rest of the townspeople were backing away slowly, finally understanding that they had spent 3 years mocking and humiliating someone who could have had them all killed with a single word. But Cora wasn't looking at them anymore. Her attention was focused entirely on Malachi, waiting for his answer to her brother's question. The problem was, Malachi didn't know what to say. Had he defended her? Had he done enough? Had he even understood who she really was? The silence stretched on, heavy with unspoken accusations and regret, until it was broken by something that changed everything once again. The sound of more horses approaching, but these were different. These were moving fast and hard, and they were coming from the opposite direction. Cora's head snapped toward the sound, and for the first time since this whole encounter began, she looked genuinely concerned. The riders that appeared on the horizon were nothing like the disciplined warriors who had arrived earlier. These men rode hard and reckless, their horses lathered with sweat, and their faces covered with bandanas. Even from a distance, Sheriff Garrett could tell they were trouble. The kind of trouble that small towns like Cedar Ridge usually couldn't handle alone. Bandits, Rufus breathed, his hand instinctively moving to his weapon. Looks like maybe 15 or 20 of them. Cora's brother spoke quickly to her in their language, his tone urgent and questioning. She responded just as rapidly, and Malachi caught enough of her body language to understand that they were discussing strategy. These weren't social visitors, and whatever was about to happen would require decisions to be made quickly. "How many people can fight in your town?" Cora asked Sheriff Garrett directly, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to planning defenses. Rufus looked startled by the directness of the question, but answered honestly. "Maybe 8 or 10 men who can handle themselves in a real fight. The rest are farmers and shopkeepers." The approaching bandits were close enough now that individual details became visible. They were heavily armed, well-mounted, and riding with the confidence of men who had done this many times before. This wasn't a random raid. These men were professionals, and they had chosen Cedar Ridge because they believed it would be easy prey. They had no idea what they were riding into. Cora turned to address the entire town, her voice carrying clearly across the street. "These men are coming to rob you, probably kill anyone who resists, and burn what they don't take. Your sheriff and his men cannot stop them alone." She paused, letting that harsh reality sink in. "But my warriors can." The offer hung in the air like smoke from a campfire. Protection, offered by the very people the town had spent years fearing and avoiding, led by the woman they had treated as a joke. The irony was so thick it was almost choking. Otis Clay, who had been silent since the warriors arrived, finally found his voice. "What do you want in return?" he asked, his words barely above a whisper. Cora's smile was cold as winter wind. "An apology," she said simply, "from every person who found entertainment in my humiliation. A public acknowledgement that you were wrong about who I am and what I'm worth." Before anyone could respond, the sound of gunfire erupted from the edge of town. The bandits had arrived at full gallop, whooping and hollering, firing their weapons into the air to create maximum fear and chaos. They expected the townspeople to scatter like frightened rabbits, clearing the way for an easy robbery. Instead, they found themselves facing 200 mounted warriors who had been waiting for exactly this moment. The bandits pulled up short, their celebration dying in their throats as they realized they had ridden straight into a trap they never saw coming. The standoff lasted exactly 30 seconds. That's how long it took for the bandit leader to understand that his 15 men were facing odds that would make charging into hell seem like a reasonable alternative. 200 warriors, armed and ready, positioned with military precision around a town that was supposed to be defenseless. It was the kind of trap that ended careers and lives with equal efficiency. The bandit leader, a scarred man with graying hair who had survived more raids than most men saw sunrises, raised his hand to signal his men to hold their fire. He was smart enough to recognize when a situation had gone beyond salvageable, and experienced enough to know that sometimes the best victory was the one where you lived to ride away. "We seem to have made a mistake," he called out, his voice carrying across the space between his men and the encircling warriors. "We'll just be moving along now if it's all the same to you folks." Cora's brother spoke a single word in their language, and the response was immediate. Every warrior drew their weapon in perfect unison, the sound like a thunderclap rolling across the prairie. The message was unmistakable. Nobody was leaving until this situation had been resolved completely. Sheriff Garrett stepped forward, finding his courage now that he had 200 allies backing him up. "I don't think so," he said firmly. "You boys came here planning to rob and terrorize innocent people. You don't get to just ride away because the odds turned against you." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. 15 desperate men surrounded by overwhelming force, while the entire population of Cedar Ridge watched from the safety of their doorways and windows. But it was Cora who broke the silence. her voice cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. "Otis Clay!" she called out, her eyes finding the store owner who was trying to hide behind his own building. "Step forward." Otis emerged reluctantly, his face white as fresh snow, his hands shaking visibly. He approached Cora like a man walking to his own execution, which, given the circumstances, might not have been far from the truth. "You have something to say to me," Cora continued, her voice loud enough that every person in town could hear every word. "Something you should have said 3 years ago and every day since then." Otis glanced around desperately, looking for support or escape, but finding neither. The bandits were watching with professional interest, the warriors with deadly patience, and his fellow townspeople with a mixture of shame and relief that they weren't the ones being called out first. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words barely audible. "Louder," Cora commanded, "so that everyone can hear what a man sounds like when he finally tells the truth." Otis Clay's public apology rang across Cedar Ridge like a church bell calling people to confession. "I'm sorry, Cora Brooks," he said, his voice shaking but clear enough for everyone to hear. "I was wrong to treat you the way I did. I was cruel and stupid, and I had no right to make you the target of my entertainment. I apologize for every word, every joke, every time I made you feel less than human." One by one, other townspeople stepped forward. Mrs. Henderson, her husband, the baker who had snickered behind Cora's back, the women who had whispered cruel comments at church socials. Each apology was different, but they all carried the same weight of genuine remorse and the desperate hope for forgiveness from someone who now held their lives in her hands. When the last apology had been given, Cora turned her attention back to the bandits who had been forced to witness the entire humiliating spectacle. "As for you," she said, addressing their leader directly, "you came here to rob these people. Instead, you're going to help them." The bandit leader's eyebrows shot up. "Help them how?" "You're going to work," Cora explained matter-of-factly. "Building, repairing, improving this town until you've paid back what you intended to steal. My warriors will ensure you stay motivated and honest in your efforts." It wasn't a request. It was a sentence, delivered by someone with the power to enforce it absolutely. The bandits would become laborers, contributing to the community they had planned to destroy, under the watchful eyes of 200 warriors who would ensure they kept their word. But it was what happened next that truly changed everything. Malachi stepped forward, his face set with determination, and spoke directly to Cora's brother in his halting attempt at their language. His pronunciation was terrible and his grammar was worse, but his meaning was clear. He was asking for permission to learn, to understand, to become part of the family he had married into without knowing it. Cora's brother studied Malachi for a long moment, then broke into a smile that transformed his entire face. He responded in English, heavily accented but perfectly understandable. "You defend her honor now." "Yes? You stand with her when others laugh?" "Yes," Malachi said firmly. "Always." The transformation of Cedar Ridge happened gradually over the following months. The bandits, now permanent residents working off their debt, proved surprisingly skilled at construction and farming. The townspeople, humbled by their experience and genuinely grateful for their salvation, began treating everyone with a respect that had been missing for years. And Cora, no longer hiding who she was, became the bridge between two worlds that had found a way to coexist. She never again endured a cruel word or mocking glance. Instead, she was greeted with the deference due to someone who commanded warriors, forgave enemies, and had chosen to use her power for protection rather than revenge. The woman they had laughed at had become the leader they never knew they needed, and Cedar Ridge was stronger for it. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale, where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.